Hi everybody. In this lecture we'll be talking about how social class can impact your life. Particularly we'll be talking about social mobility, and then we'll also talk about how poverty is defined. Belonging to a certain social class has profound consequences for individuals in all areas of their life. It's not just how much money you can spend on a new PlayStation, it is the type of education you can afford and when you can afford to attain that education. It's the type of job you can get because of that education, and then that job also feeds into your socioeconomic status. It's your medical care. So is your job going to give you good health insurance? Is it not going to give you good health insurance? And then that medical care can dictate how we're born and what kind of hospital we're born into and the quality care we're born into, and then how we die. Can we afford to be in a nice nursing home, or are we going to be locked in a nasty nursing home and waste away there? Similarly, SES dictates our entertainment and our hobbies, the things we do for fun, and what we can do for fun, what we can't do for fun, where we can travel, where we can't travel, all of these things. Like, it's really critical to our life. Social mobility is the movement of individuals or groups within the hierarchical system of social class. Social mobility may be either closed or open. So in a closed system, there is very little opportunity to move from one class or from one status to another. In an open system, there are a lot of opportunities to move from one class or one status to another. Within remember we talked about the Indian caste system in the last lecture. We also talked about slavery. We also talked about apartheid. Those are all closed systems. The American class system is not necessarily entirely open, but more open than those other systems. You can make a very good argument that over the last 20 years, we've definitely moved toward being more of a closed system because it's harder to attain higher class status. But technically, we are still classifiable as an open system. In addition to closed systems and open systems, we have intergenerational mobility and intragenerational mobility. Intergenerational mobility is the movement between social classes that occurs from one generation to the next generation. So if your family saves up all their money they're working class and they save their money to send you to college, then that is an example of the previous generation helping the next generation move up in social class. So that's a family moving from one class to another over the course of a generation, between generations. Intragenerational mobility, then, is the movement between social classes that occur over the course of one person's lifetime. So let's say you, after high school, went off to work to save up money on your own, and you worked for a number of years and you worked up the ranks in that company, and then either the company pays for or you pay for yourself to go to college yourself, and then you get a job of a higher class status. Then that is an example of intragenerational mobility. You within your generation moving up to the next class. We also have horizontal social mobility or vertical social mobility. Horizontal social mobility is the movement of an individual within an occupation or within groups of a social class. So I grew up outside Pittsburgh, so I often talk about steel when I talk about this. When I was young in the 1990s, the steel mills were mostly closed down, right? So people that worked their lives in steel had to find a new job. And if someone was laid off from the steel mill, he could go find a job in a sawmill, and that would be an example of horizontal social mobility. So he went from working in one working class job to another working class job. Vertical social mobility, then, is the movement between social classes and is often dependent on going either upward or downward in social mobility. So let's say you work really hard in that steel mill and you get up to being a manager and then you get up to being like a higher manager. That is you going up in rank. Or let's say you do a lousy job at the steel mill and you get fired for being, oh, I don't know, a drug addict or something. That is downward social mobility. And then structural mobility. The examples up to this point have been examples of individual mobility where individual people move from one class to another. This can also occur on structural grounds. So let's say you're working in that steel mill that didn't have a union, and then the workers form a union. They're able to negotiate for higher benefits, higher wages, and then they collectively move from working class to middle class. That is an example of the structure of the workers within that factory raising their class status. Similarly, though, when those mills closed, the steel mills closed outside of Pittsburgh, most people suffered downward structural mobility. There were not enough jobs to go around. So the majority of the working class in those areas became more poor. Now let's talk about defining poverty. What exactly do we mean when we talk about poverty? In the United States, the federal poverty line is an absolute measure of annual income and is frequently used to determine who should be and who should not be categorized as poor. Now, it's very important to categorize the poor to say definitively, you are poor, you are not poor, because that dictates whether you qualify for things like food stamps, whether you qualify for heating assistance or cooling assistance, or public housing, or all kinds of things. In 2009, about 47.8 million people, which is 15.7% of the population, were considered poor. And this is, again, according to federal guidelines. However, federal guidelines, and my wife, who's a social worker, will tell you, are not necessarily synced up with who we as a collective of Americans would think of as being poor. Those federal guidelines are, in all likelihood, depending on what your life situation is, lower than what you would consider poor is. So when we talk about poverty, we talk about relative deprivation and then absolute deprivation that I'll talk about in a second. Relative deprivation is a relative measure of poverty based on the standards of living of the community. So in terms of relative deprivation, if you're considered poor if you're not capable of living at the same standard of the rest of people in society like yourself. So if everyone else in your community goes on 2 vacations a year and has a super big house, and you can't, but you're comfortable, but you can't afford those things, then in a way you are considered to be relatively deprived. You might be treated as if you're the poor person. And it goes the other way. I grew up in a relatively impoverished working class town. No one had much of anything really, but what would be considered poor in other areas was just our normal. So you had to be really hurting to be considered relatively deprived in our area. Now, absolute deprivation, this is a picture from the Appalachian region where I grew up in. Absolute deprivation is an objective measure of poverty that is defined by the inability to meet minimal standards for food, shelter, clothing, or health care. That picture didn't turn out as well as I intended to, but if you could see, there are holes in those roofs. Those are not enclosed buildings, and those are buildings that people live in, right? When we talk about minimal standards, we're talking about being warm in the winter or cool in the summer. We are talking about having not only enough food to eat, but also nutritional food. We're talking about access to health care. These are standards of absolute deprivation. Nationwide, well, first of all, in Ohio, where I live, in central Ohio, 1 in 5 children go hungry on a regular basis. It's not just that they don't have healthy food, which they don't. It's that they are suffering from physical effects of not getting enough calories. That is absolute deprivation. And our problem is a little bit worse in central Ohio, which is actually a largely urban area, so it's really shocking. But uh, that 1 in 5 in central Ohio is not that abnormal nationwide. There are areas that are a little bit higher or a little bit lower, but that's a figure that you can basically think of as about being right in our country. A culture of poverty then refers to learned attitudes that can help that develop among the poor or in poor communities and lead the poor to accept their fate rather than attempting to improve their situation. So if you grew up in a working class neighborhood and then you went off to college and then you came back and people said something like, "Oh, check out college boy over there. He thinks you think you know any more than I do," right? Something like that. Or people saying stuff like, "Oh, what do you need college for anyway? Just go get a job and you'll be fine," right? Those are examples of culture of poverty, and it takes a lot of different uh, forms. It could be something like people just being absolutely content with what they have, which to a degree is a virtue, but not having the vision that things can be a little bit better, right? Those are elements of the culture of poverty. So for this week, I want you to watch the documentary that I gave you a link to on the discussion. It is called People Like Us. It was produced by PBS. Oh, it's getting old, about 15 years ago now, but it's still a really good documentary, and the fundamentals haven't changed. Uh, and I want you to, for that, in the discussion, write about if you could send a message to one person in the film, what would it be? What would you say to that one person? How would you correct them? What kind of vision would you give them of your lived situation or whatever about the rest of society? And then look at other people's comments and see if how their comments compare to yours and have your discussion like that. And then your quiz 3 is going to be due Sunday, and I look forward to grading those as well. So I will see you in the discussion boards, and have a good week.